work on an issue like ranked choice voting. I'm Jean Massey. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Vote Minnesota. We are, importantly, a nonpartisan organization and a nonprofit that advocates for more inclusive, representative, and open election systems. I think most of us may not agree on all the fixes to our democracy, but we probably all agree it needs a little bit of work. Right now, right? And that's the space we fill, is to make sure that we are advocating and promoting and advancing and putting in place election systems that work for all of us. That's our mission at Fair Vote Minnesota. I've been involved in this for the better part of more than 10 years. I kind of saw some problems starting in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and thought ranked choice voting is a real response to some of the issues that we're starting to see in the problems of our elections. Got involved and led the campaign to bring ranked choice voting to Minneapolis. And then became the executive director of Fair Vote Minnesota and helped St. Paul come next. West St. Paul next, right?
Yeah.
And now St. Louis Park is the third city to adopt ranked choice voting, and they start using it this year. All of those initiatives really happened in very different ways, but they were all grassroots initiatives by voters like us. Voters like you, a voter like me, concerned about the quality of our democracy and wanting to do something about it. In Minneapolis, the city council voted to put a question to the voters back in 2006 already, and first used in 2009. In St. Paul, the voters petitioned to put it on the ballot, and it passed. And in St. Louis Park, the city council unanimously adopted ranked choice voting. They believed that they really wanted to walk the talk. They have an initiative in their community to promote more diversity and inclusion in everything they do, and saw ranked choice voting as the way to do that in the elections, locally for their municipal races. So they are doing it this year. We don't see a lot of competitive races, so it's not all the news yet, but we hope that there will be, and we can put that in place. Ranked choice voting is starting to become really important and serious reform. It's pretty new still as a concept across the country. Less new to people here in Minnesota. Some states don't have any initiatives around ranked choice voting, so people in Minnesota are a little bit more familiar, but it's still relatively new, but it's catching on fast. Why? Because it's working in cities now across the country, not just here in Minnesota. It's proven. The benefits that we hoped would materialize are materializing. They're actually very real, and I'm going to take a deep dive into some of those benefits so that you understand the power that ranked choice voting can come to transform our elections for the better. And because Maine became the first state to adopt ranked choice voting for statewide elections.
Yeah.
Did some of you know that?
Maine
used it last year.
So far, right?
It's the only one, but I think it's going to happen like this. Cat's out of the bag on this one, because our democracy is in such peril, and this is such a great response to so many of those problems. And if we know that ranked choice voting can work at a state level, other states are now wanting to take that on. There were a couple of consequential races in Maine that made a real big difference in 2018 that put this on the map. The first is the governor's race. Maine used ranked choice voting in the primary for governor. And in the Democratic race, it was a wide open field with many candidates. And the person who won was able to build a strong coalition to win in that primary, giving her a launching pad to run competitively in the general election and win. The reverse would have been a process that I think we're going to start to see in the presidential election, which is why I have it up on the screen, which is when you've got a field that big and vote splitting is the way that you win, you campaign in a very different way. Your goal is to try to go negative on many of the candidates so that you move votes away from them and to you. Ranked choice voting allows you to build that coalition and then run with strength into the general election. The other consequential race in Maine was the second congressional race. Long held by a Republican, and the incumbent was on the ballot. It was a four-way race, a Democrat, a Republican, and two independents. Rather than that vote being split, those votes were pooled. So the Democrat in the race placed second in the first round, and then went on to become the winner of that race, because when the independents were able to cast a second choice, those votes pooled in his favor. So people are starting to see the value of making sure that we have a system that results in a majority winner. And that's really the goal of ranked choice voting. It ensures that whoever steps forward to run for office says, I want to do this and I want to serve as many people as I can. And a system that allows me to get a majority of the vote is the best way I can do that. Right now, that's not the case. So let's go back to the DFL primary in 2018. We all saw what happened. There was the governor's race, there was the attorney general's race, there were several Senate or legislative races with many candidates on the ballot. In the primary, many races resulted in candidates without a majority of the vote. And they came out of that process weaker than they needed to come out. They could have come out already having built that coalition going into November rather than rebuilding that coalition after the primaries. That's the power of ranked choice voting, is that ability to build the bigger tent and the coalition and come out of that with a great reputation rather than being tarnished. So the way the ranked choice voting works, let me see a raise of hands to see how many people have some understanding of how this works. So pretty strong. But for those of you who may not be as familiar, we're going to just walk through it. And rather than doing a video on the screen, I think I'll walk through the example here on the brochure, and then we'll just recap with an example on our website. So on the back of your brochure, you see a simple example, which is pretty common in terms of how a governor's race might work. First, your ballot looks differently than the current ballot. Rather than being given the option to vote for just one, now you can rank your options first choice, second choice, third choice, or more. And that's it. On the voter's end, that's all you do. And you go in with the power to rank, rather than feeling the need to be strategic and voting for a candidate you think is safer, you don't want to spoil the election or hand the election to a candidate you don't like. And so strategic voting is the way we normally vote. And we can be guaranteed in the presidential race, that's how we're all going to feel the need to vote right now. And I'm going to give you all the power to experience ranking in the presidential race. That's why this is up on the screen. So then what happens in the ranking is, you tally everyone's ballots, that's the first choice. And if one candidate is popular with a majority of the vote, like President Obama in his second go-around, well then the election is won and that's it. There's no additional rounds of counting. But like in a convention, when you have to get to 60%, and I assume most of you have been to a convention, you go into another round to keep pooling that support toward a threshold. In the case of a convention, it's 60%. Under a normal public election, it's 50%. 50% plus one. It means more people vote for that person than against that person. That's a simple definition of a majority. So if no candidate gets that, then you have the rankings to do the runoff. And rather than asking people to come back and cast a second ballot, your rankings are used. So you eliminate the candidate who's in last place. In this election, it's orange. So orange is out, and anyone who voted for orange now has their second choice count in the second round. Some voted for dark blue, some voted for light blue. Ultimately, light blue wins. And as we saw in round one, light blue had a slight edge in that race and went on to become the majority winner. But that's not always the case. We need to ask voters who their second preferences are in order to ensure that we do gain the majority vote. Does that make sense to people? Okay. Could you just click on that petition? I think it should come up.
Which one?
Just click on the banner.
Oh, okay.
And in fact, who's got smartphones? Does everybody have a smartphone? Let's take them out. We'll just all and go through an example. It's fairvotemn.org. Oh, is it not working? Could you just go up to the top then, to the top bar, the URL, and do /rank2020? .org /rank2020. If you've got it, raise your hand.
I'm gonna do a
Good.
slash.
Yeah, / rank 2020. Oh, you're in our system. There you go. All right. So,
Feature.
this is not a way to promote, but if you want to rank, even if you signed up anyway, this is a quick way to do it. Just provide your name and then you get to rank. And we'll show you how that works. And if you don't want to, Christine, go ahead and add your name since you're already in our system and we'll just show you how it works. Okay?
/2020?
Correct.
Rank.
Rank 2020.
Oh, right.
What if we've done it already?
Oh, then you can't do it again, right?
I already did it too.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I said, good. So you already felt that power.
it was power and ignorance, because I'm like, I don't know half these.
Right, so you stop ranking. This is a good question.
Mhm.
You stop ranking when you don't have preferences. Don't vote for someone you don't know or someone you simply don't like. It's called preference voting, so you stop when you don't have anyone else you want to vote for. But I can guarantee you all have more than one, almost. And you can just make it up if you don't want to explain. Share to the world who your first
Okay.
preference
This
is.
is
This
random.
all make- this is all
Everyone,
make
this is
believe.
random.
It's all-
I'm
I know, you're gonna close your eyes and pick, yeah, okay.
Oh, come on.
Imagine if we could do it this way. Imagine. And then the candidate comes out building that coalition, asking for second choices all along the way, rather than going negative on who they fear is going to be at the top of the perch. Oh, she goes all the way down. All right, well, there we go.
What's the matter with Steve? He's at the bottom, I don't know who that is even, so.
Yeah, some of these people we don't know. But we do know Pete's surging in the polls and media, right?
Yeah.
Sure, it's off the ballot, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we vote, and I'm not sure if the results are showing up yet. Should I vote? Go ahead and vote. Yeah, it's not showing up yet, we have to reset it. So my apologies. So I can't tell you who's on top, but when we open it up, I'll make sure you all get a link and see how that poll is doing actually, because people are treating it seriously and actually casting the ballots. And someone in this poll is ahead, we just don't know who that is yet.
Gee,
But
we can share that at the fair, Chiefs curds always comes in number one.
yeah, we do this in the fair. You can put anything on the ballot, and this is what we'd like to put on the ballot,
So
our presidential candidate.
realistically, would you get to vote for as many candidates as there are, or is it just the top 3?
You can, most systems allow for you to go as far as you wish, or at least up to 6, like St. Paul does. Minneapolis started with just a limitation of 3 because of limitations on the machinery, but that's been all upgraded now, and by 2021, they'll have new software in place and the ability to go further in ranking. For an election this big, we want to go beyond 3. That just makes sure that your vote continues to count when those candidates get under the threshold. So let me just walk through with you what this means for 2020, because it's a big deal. Some of you might remember in 2016 that we had crushing primaries for presidential election, right? You probably had lines going out the door for all these caucuses.
Oh, yeah.
The DNC required all parties to do one of 2 things. Either move to a primary, and that's what Minnesota has done. So now, March 3rd, we're going to vote in the primary. But you're going to just be able to vote for one. So sorry to get your hopes up here. But by the next time, hopefully we can have a ranked ballot. Because there just wasn't the ability to get this passed, especially out of the Senate, for use for next year's primary. However, some states are hopefully going to have a primary that's ranked, Maine included. New Hampshire was moving forward, but I think they won't. But caucuses will. So the DNC said, if you're not gonna move to a primary, allow everyone to vote, early voting including, or all day on the Tuesday, late until 8 at night, you have to allow ways for remote voters in a caucus to also be able to cast their straw vote. So Iowa, Nevada, others have kept the caucuses, and they have to provide a way for people at home to also vote. Iowa and Nevada have walking some caucuses. as you may know what those are. That means that if I vote for a candidate who's too weak to stay viable, I get to walk to my second preference. So they get a ranked ballot in Iowa, first caucus. They get a ranked ballot if you're at home. So we're already going to see it in action. And the good news about all of that is that candidates will need to start to comport in a ranked choice voting style. Right off the bat in Iowa, they're gonna have to be actively seeking second choice votes heading into the caucuses. Nevada is second, same thing. And if Maine does it, we'll have at least 3 places where candidates are now campaigning in that style. And that's going to be meaningful for all of us. The rest of the states will probably just be vote for one, so it's not gonna continue, but it'll start that way.
So to be clear, for those caucuses, or that would be convention when you do a walking caucus, where you can either be present or you can mail in a ranked choice voting ballot, let's say?
There,
Or-
if you go to the Iowa Democratic Party page or Nevada, they've got the whole book. There's more, it's more involved than that.
Okay.
There's some, I think there's some virtual voting options, it's not just
Mhm.
mail it in. And I think there's some online options as well. So there are a number of modes through which you can participate, which is great because people want, the DNC wants to accommodate more voters in that primary process. There'll still be caucuses in Minnesota, as you know. You're part of the Senate District 52, so you're probably planning those already. We still have state elections, we have issues to get through. But the straw poll component of that in the presidential year now is moved to a primary. We won't do that here at the polls. Yeah. So I'm just gonna pause, take any questions about the process, how it might work, yes.
Yeah, if you have, let's say, 5 candidates, do you then start with the lowest ranking one and see where these votes go, and then check again, and then move to the next lowest, or how does it work?
Yes, so in this simple example, it's just one candidate defeated, and those votes were reallocated. In an election this big, you just start at the bottom, drop the lowest vote getter, and then move those votes on to the next candidate.
And
So they
each
get
time you
to go
have
to-
moved them, you
Their
count
second
them?
choice goes to the next person.
To the next person, and if I have a ballot that's 5 deep in my preferences, if I vote for everyone who's at the bottom because I'm that renegade voter, and I just like that those are my values, then my vote just keeps transferring as those candidates get eliminated.
So it's possible that somebody who was ranked 4th gets a lot of secondary and tertiary votes, and all of a sudden jumps up.
That can happen, but it's just like in a convention hall. If the contest is really close, this is where it happens. If you've got a 4 or 5-way race that's this big, and the people at the top are that close, anything can happen, right? If you're only separated by 2-3 percentage points, sure, you can be overtaken. That can happen. Now, if it starts out with the first choice, the front runner with 45% of the vote, and the next vote getter with 35% of the vote, the chances of overtaking that candidate are pretty slim. But in a highly contested race, that's why we ask people to rank, and we have a way to ascertain the will of the majority, is to have those preferences transferred. There is a difference, of course, in the caucuses. Again, as you know, as party members, the allocation of delegates is determined by the primary votes. But there's a threshold of viability. So in this process, what it means is, if you vote for a candidate who doesn't meet that threshold of viability, 15% I believe, then your vote can be reallocated. If you vote for a candidate who's viable at 15%, your first choice stays with that candidate. One of the benefits of ranked choice voting is that your second choice can never harm your first choice. You love your first choice, and you don't want it overtaken by a second preference or a backup, only when that candidate is defeated. Right. So again, using it in this context, we don't get to one winner with the majority of the vote, because the purpose of the allocation of delegates is different in this case.
So one thing I really like about it is that you vote once. So the efficiency is amazing, right? You don't have to go do rounds and rounds of voting. It's just a one-time vote, and you've got all your ranked choices right there.
So in use in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we know it's really simple to use. 90% of the voters are ranking their ballots. That means they get it. Now, we do voter education, community voter education. We also do education with candidates because you can imagine candidates go, what is this? Teach me how to do it. And we help train candidates and their campaign staff in doing this. And we work closely with the media so that the media is adequately explaining this. So when communities come to actually implement this, voters are saying, I got it, this is easy. And we poll them, and they poll at 90% proficiency levels. Really straightforward stuff. Spoiled ballot rates, about the same as any other election, and know that anytime you overvote, you always get your ballot spit back out at you. So we have learned now that with every round of implementation, it gets smoother and easier for the voters. People are accustomed to it. And now communities deciding to pick it up have a ready blueprint. You don't have to repeat the wheel at all. St. Louis Park just basically took the components of what they needed out of Minneapolis and St. Paul and set the system up. And that would be true for West St. Paul, Egan, anywhere in these communities. That would be the case. And voters also, when we poll them, say, we would never go back. So let me describe for a moment what we replaced in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and now why other communities are so excited to be looking at adopting this. In local elections, they're all nonpartisan. Everyone understand what that means? It does get tricky because people campaign politically by party affiliation even at a local level. What it means is that you run in a primary regardless of your party. You advance the top 2 candidates in a race for a single seat, or the top 4 candidates in an at-large vote for 2 race, no matter the party. So it could be all Democrats, all Republicans, or a mix. So you don't have one from each party. That's what it means to be nonpartisan. In those nonpartisan primaries, some of the communities here have local primaries, some don't. And those who don't figured out that that's for a good reason because no one shows up. Turnout in these local primaries is about 5%. A little bit higher for those that hold elections in even years alongside state and federal races. But I kid you not, and I'm sure that none of the communities here would be an aberration. The vote total for local races in the general election is anywhere between at least 5 times up to 10 or 12 times higher. How many people weigh in November as opposed to August? Early August when you're at the cabin, when students aren't in town, I mean, every number of reasons. And even if we have a competitive gubernatorial race, like we did last November, that doesn't mean people go down ballot to your local races. Why? Because systematically, we simply don't cover them. Candidates don't campaign beyond the people they know who are going to turn out, so we hyper-target. The media doesn't give them any attention. And voters just say, well, I don't know enough to really weigh in, but they will in November. So ranked choice voting allows us to roll the primary into the general and run one decisive election when turnout is highest and importantly more diverse and more representative. And that's why you were saying it's such a benefit. Communities have figured this out and they're saying, why are we going to run these local primaries that are so exclusive? Well, we don't have to.
And expensive.
And expensive. Yep. And Minneapolis, St. Paul, and St. Louis Park all have odd year elections, so they have that primary as a standalone thing every 2 years, which makes no sense at all. Yes.
So I don't really know anything about this, but I think so far you've just talked about all the pluses, which clearly there are a lot. Could you talk about the negatives, like what's lost? Or?
I get asked that a lot. You know, I'm just going to be honest. So there's no perfect voting system. This is a democracy. It gets messy. But ranked choice voting does something over our current system that we as an organization, I personally value very highly. It makes sure that the majority of us has our way, as opposed to a minority of us. And if we believe that that's how we should function as a democracy, then ranked choice voting is the method to do that with, rather than a plurality system. I'm going to talk a minute about the plurality system so we understand the dynamic of how ranked choice voting kind of fixes that. The key questions we get is, will it be confusing, especially if it's new for voters? Sure, it can be, but with some pretty minimal and modest education, voters do understand that. It's nonpartisan. The goal of this is to make sure that anyone from any party who aspires to run and serve aspires to do that with a majority of voters. It doesn't favor any party. It really is a way to empower voters as a part of the process. We call it the voters' voting system. So we certainly get partisan concerns because parties are used to campaigning in a certain way. So Republicans will often say it's a Democratic conspiracy, and Democrats will call it a Republican conspiracy. It's no such thing. It really is just a way voters can have more power over our electoral system.
Is it more expensive for candidates because they have to run longer? At least the primary, you know, you're done at a certain, and then somebody else goes on for months. But this way, everybody has to run all the way to the general.
We wondered about that, so we've been tracking it.
Mhm.
Candidates will actually say, I saved the cost of an election. Every election is a cost center. And if I have to run in a primary and literally hyper-target to 5% of the voters and spend all that money when I have to leave most of the voters even out of the conversation, I don't benefit. And then I lose in August when I really want the attention in November. So candidates really favor a way that's more open and inclusive for them, and then they can build that coalition into November. Most candidates don't really want to get weeded out in August. So the way that ranked choice voting can work is you don't have to jumpstart it quite so early. You can jumpstart it a little bit later because you know you've got through November to do that. And as we saw in the mayor's race in 2017 in Minneapolis, it was a really wide open field and highly competitive, and I will go through those elections online here. But it was pretty surprising, I think, to a lot of people how that lined up, who placed first, second, and third, and fourth, right? So it really does engage more voters. And one of the things that we have also monitored quite closely is whether or not this boosts participation and turnout. For sure it boosts participation because you get rid of the low turnout primary. So all of a sudden you have all those people in November really making the decision all at once together. But we're also seeing pretty significant increases in turnout now under ranked choice voting. More candidates are on the debate stage, more candidates are bringing voters out to the polls to vote for them as a first choice or as a second choice, and people are not turned off by negative campaigning. We were actually surprised by how quickly ranked choice voting incentivizes more civility in the campaigns. That doesn't mean outside expenditure groups don't sometimes still act the way they always do, but to their peril. Most of the races we saw in 2017 that had outside expenditures doing negative attacks lost. Those tactics backfire under ranked choice voting. There was a question over here, and then I'll come back here.
So I haven't really been tracking this topic much, and I'm wondering, how would like Citizens United, it sounded like you were just kind of getting around the edges of that, but if you have millions of dollars coming into any race, so you have Democrats and Republicans, independents, those all get mushed together, so all the candidates, there could be 30 candidates for president, for example, across what would be traditionally maybe 2 or 3, 6, 12 parties. Can you comment on sort of how the Citizens United kind of money, the dark money and all the money that comes in, how that might play out? To skew the election and skew the voters?
I'll simply hypothesize, because we haven't had enough experience in state partisan elections to know the answer to that question. But we've seen some interesting developments at the local level in what we call nonpartisan elections. Those interest groups still spend a lot of money in big city elections. So Minneapolis and St. Paul, we can see that. And again, what we see is that the influence of money is mitigated by the process. The way to win under ranked choice voting is not to spend more money on negative mailers because they just don't work. What does work is door knocking and just grassroots campaigning and making sure you're having enough conversations with voters, not just to ask for first choices, but now second and third choices. And money can't talk for you in that way. It can reach more voters, but it can't ask you for a second choice effectively. So we're starting to see the role of that kind of money have less influence in these races. How will it apply in a statewide partisan race where all we're used to are these big, ugly, negative ads on TV? We don't know the answer to that yet, but I would love to find out if over time it would put a dent in that process. Yes.
I went to the presentation that I think was Michael Porter and Catherine Gell
Oh, great, yeah.
gave at the U back in December. And if I'm remembering right, they said the two top, changes to the electoral system that they would recommend that were most easily doable and that would make the biggest difference quickly would be, I believe it was top 4 nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting.
Right.
So
Sure.
in a case like that where there are whatever, 30 candidates and multiple parties and things like that, conceivably at some point a choice would be made, we're gonna have a primary and the top 4 or 5 make it through the primary to the ranked choice general.
Correct. Michael Porter and Catherine Gale are two people who came and presented in Minnesota in early December. Michael Porter is a business professor at Harvard and wrote a lot of textbooks, so a lot of business people know who he is. Catherine Gale was CEO of Gale Food Companies in Wisconsin. She sold that to work on electoral reform. She saw that election dysfunction and political dysfunction was impacting her economic bottom line. And they came and spoke to an audience about how ranked choice voting is thwarting our economic competitiveness. And it's not just our economy. It's almost any issue we care about, we're not making any progress. We just sent a whole new group of people to the Minnesota House. We sent a whole new group of people to Congress. They're coming back to town halls and going, what do I do? Stuck. Again. And if we think there's light at the end of the tunnel, there really isn't. And the only way we can count
It's a
on the light
train.
at the end of the tunnel is a trifecta. Either on the Republican side or the Democratic side, because compromise is not happening.
So you're saying we need a third party then?
A little bit of competition would be good for our political space. So ranked choice voting incentivizes that competition without the punishment of the spoiler dynamic. That's the real essence of all of it. It allows for that competition, allows for those many candidates on the ballot from multiple parties without any consequence. Right now, it's all consequence. What happened when Howard Schultz said, I know? You were all reading the news.
We all hated him. Instantly.
Is he a hateable guy? Well, we don't know him.
We don't know, but
Of course
we did.
not. But we hate him. You know, anyone who's a Democrat hated him. Some Republicans were crying too. Why? Why is that with the reaction to someone who wants to serve? Ranked choice voting eliminates that whole dynamic. Someone can walk into that race and say, let me see how many votes I can get. And if he's not the most popular, she's not the most popular, settled. But not by peeling those votes away and being consequential for a party. That's a real benefit.
I think another benefit is at the end of the election, we have more data than we would have
Yes.
otherwise.
Good point.
You can go back, if you're the winner, you can go back and see, how did my constituents vote, right? Who were the other people that they were more supportive of? Because all you know is you won and the other person lost otherwise by so much percentage.
That's right.
But you don't know how it broke down.
Okay.
So I
And
think
if
it's
you
a
voted
good.
for that person who just attacked me for 9 months, you're not gonna get my attention. Because I don't like you all of a sudden. Again, that's a huge benefit. So when people take office, and why this is a promise for breaking through our gridlock, is because I take office now as a candidate who won under ranked choice voting, won with a bigger coalition.
Mhm.
And if I want to keep that coalition together and stay in office, I have to do that proactively. I don't get to just run back to my base now and be happy for 4 years.
Yeah, so I was trying to think about how it works for incumbents versus new people on the scene.
Well,
Yeah.
we have some elections that
Mhm.
I can describe in that way, but it does really matter. Jacob Fry won the Minneapolis mayor's race, and he will often say, I know what it took to get me here, and I make policy knowing that and taking that into account. So now what happens if you're in Congress or in the Minnesota House or Senate, your fear of getting primaried now goes way down. Because there's more political competition in the space, and you need 50% of the vote to win. your primary base of voters who might primary you no longer has the same power. And that's why it's a hoped-for solution in part to cutting through the gridlock situation we're in. There's a chart that Catherine Gale and Michael Porter showed, I didn't bring that with me, but again, I can send materials to you, that shows that over the past decade, there has been no bipartisan legislation in Congress. Not since the Welfare Act under Clinton, where there was some bipartisan support for that, whether or not you agreed with it or not, there was bipartisan support. Since then, the Tax Act, the Obamacare, any major piece of legislation has been done by one single party. The bad news is, of course, once that's the case, it's undone by the next party in power. Right? And who loses? We all lose. So, I've gotten used to saying that our electoral system is the single biggest problem we have. To be able to solve all the other biggest problems that we have. It really is getting in the way of our democracy. And the good news is we can fix it. We can do this. It's happening. And that's why it's a great time to be promoting this and getting it going in more communities and at the state level. There are a coalition of people working across the states to help move this faster in statewide reform. Here in Minnesota, it's happening at the local level right now actively in Red Wing, Rochester, Minnetonka, and Plymouth, and Bloomington. It could happen in any of these communities too, if you have a charter. If you don't, we're trying to pass this year a local options bill that would authorize all statutory jurisdictions, those without their own charter, to also do this. And that could apply to counties and school boards too. So I didn't bring that data with me either. Anyone know if you're a charter city?
West St. Paul is.
West St. Paul's a charter city, so you can do it. You could go ahead and.
Yep, consider it done.
There you go. Talk to city council. Anyone here on the city council or a school board or elected official? I didn't ask that question. So the conversations begin with your local officials, see what their thoughts are, organize some community meetings, and we would work with you to help with data collection, help identify some of the important kinds of conversations to have and what the process is. It's not that complicated. You need to amend the charter, which you would do through a charter amendment. That can be done as a vote by the voters, and then the council or the voters could put a question on the ballot.
Doug, are you writing the new charter right now?
Are you on a charter commission?
He is.
On a charter commission, there you go. Or the city council could say in a unanimous fashion, we think this is right for our community. And just pass it. That's how it happened in St. Louis Park. And again, the implementation is getting simpler and simpler. So it's available to all of us. And I should just note for those, because you're here as part of the Democratic Party, you do know the Democratic Party has a stance on ranked choice voting on the platform?
It's a-
Did they support it?
Yes.
As long as it stays in the party. What if it's we get rid of the presidential primaries and just ranked choice?
Well,
All our
even statewide,
Or, yeah, what if you could rank a Democrat and then rank your, it's a second choice be a independent and your third choice be a Republican? Could you ever do that? Could that ever work?
Well, it just gives you, the voter, the privacy in your voting booth to vote your heart.
Mhm.
And you do that what you want.
Mhm.
Now, if you're all real strong Democrats and that's gonna be your first choice, great. And you might have a second choice as an independent, there's a moderate, I don't know, whatever your personal preferences is really the goal. But what it does is when someone decides to run and splits that vote, that person will get support, and rather than playing the spoiler role, now your votes can transfer.
so more people
Yes.
will run, probably.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
I actually have been a fan of ranked choice voting since the 2000 election, when I think it would have made a big difference. I mean, our presidential campaign was such a disaster, but one of the things that ranked choice voting does is it gives you permission to vote for a third party, which then gives
Yes.
the third party the opportunity to build support in a way that otherwise people are too afraid to vote for third parties, which gives us different voices in our electoral system, right? Because sometimes those third parties are, like, in the foreseeable future, never gonna win a majority, but they can bring a lot to the conversation and really push the debate in different ways and can be really effective. But of course, like, I'm never gonna vote for a third party in a presidential election again. I mean, the only time I felt like I could do that, I was 19 years old and like, you know, not as scary.
Then you
but-
grow up and get wise to that strategy.
No,
And then there's the whole Jesse Ventura debacle.
Yeah.
So it doesn't,
but it is
matters.
scary and it really matters, and we have Trump in the presidential office right now, and I wanted to respond to that comment before about if there are any negatives, and I wouldn't say that I wouldn't call this a negative, but I would say that in Minneapolis in 2017, you could really see the way that it changed the conversation and how it forces people to campaign differently, and I was surprised at the way things shook out too, and I think there can be some sort of growing pains with the like big elections and figuring out exactly like what you should be asking people to do. But I don't think that's a reason to not do it. I just think it's like it is different.
I think we're in a rut in the way things have always been done, and there's gonna be growing pains trying to come out of that rut, but I think we need to come out of the rut.
But there was a lot of like, make me your second choice vote, which is like not the way
It's like,
that.
I'm number
Different
two.
mindset.
Yeah.
right, but that's because they had already pretty much locked up their first choices, and now in order to win, they needed second choices. And they campaigned heavily, and those who were most effective in getting seconds and thirds won. So let me show you a couple of videos of candidates in 2017, because it really brings home the value, especially from a candidate point of view, but you can hear it transcend into the voting population. And we've got videos of voters' experience, time dependent. I can show some of that. So could you go to
Max had a,
news?
do you have a comment?
I just had one statistic that I wanted to bring up that's relative to us in the second congressional district. So in the 2016 election, Andy Craig versus Jason Lewis, Andy Craig lost by 7,000 votes. Paula Overby, the third party candidate, got 30,000 votes. If 1 in 4 of the people that voted for Paula Overby was able to put a second vote in for Andy Craig, she would have won the 2016 election. We would have never had Jason Lewis in office.
Yes.
That's a prime
Sign me
example, and that didn't happen in the second congressional race in Maine this year. Same dynamic, independents splitting that vote, but they could pull back in Maine's case, and they couldn't in Angie's race.
That's the problem they've had with their governor forever too. Because they have third parties getting major amounts of votes, and so their governor's never getting more than like, I think 44% of the vote or something like that.
Yeah, in his third reelection.
Mhm.
It started at about 35% of the vote. And he was a hugely polarizing figure, so became a real kind of walking example about the need. We don't want a system that gets us someone who will only govern to their base. That's not good for democracy.
I really have kind of two questions, but my first one is there any information or a belief of how this might affect gerrymandering going into the future?
Good question. Gerrymandering is a problem in some states for sure, not as much of a problem here in Minnesota. I'm hoping redistricting reform happens here in Minnesota. I can't guarantee it will, but I think we need to do it to prevent in Minnesota what has happened in other states and make it independent and fair. A challenge we have with any time we draw boundaries for single seat elections is we self-sort politically. So no matter how perfectly and fair we draw boundaries, we might still be predominantly one party or another in any district. And so they lack competition. Right. So the bigger solution to that issue is to actually draw, and this is what in part Michael Porter and Catherine Gale were getting to, draw bigger districts and have 3 members in each district get elected rather than just 1. This is in Congress, not Senate, right? But in the Minnesota House or in Congress, draw bigger districts, so we vote for up to 3, or we rank, and then we help elect. And more voters are represented directly by someone who voted for them. Because right now, if you're in a split district, and there are several of them in Minnesota right now, If you're on the other party who lost, you're literally voiceless.
Oh, we found that out.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
As you know. So the way to do that is to have three, and then you're gonna be represented by at least one of them. That's the way to do it. You rank. Threshold for winning is lower, so in a three-person race, the threshold's 25% of the vote. So you just have to campaign to get 25, and that means more of us are represented directly. So that's the bigger, longer-term solution to deal with the severity of impact of how we draw boundaries. Strategically in Minnesota, that's going to be another step. But if that gerrymandering gets to be a problem, I'd say that we could get to that solution faster. Strategically, our goal is to get the local options bill passed this year. Then start to push for a statewide bill next year or the year after. And really be ready for when we have support in both the House and in the Senate and get this done. We need it very desperately in Minnesota. We have many elections where this would be applied very efficiently and effectively in our state partisan elections. It's true for almost every state, but in Minnesota we have a big history in our gubernatorial races and in many legislative races why we need to have this kind of system. So our push is to do that. And every local example helps build an understanding and familiarity and the experience of it, and builds the political coalitions to get this done.
Will it pass?
The local options bill, right now, it's in the omnibus bill, so that's a good place for it to be. Can't be singled out and pulled out for anything. So it's in the House in the omnibus bill. It'll pass out of the State Finance Committee and be married to a state finance bill in the state government finance bill in the Senate. That finance bill's gonna look a little bit skinnier coming out of the Senate than in the House. And the question will be what stays in, what goes out. Stay tuned, and if you signed up on our list, we'll update you very regularly on the status of that bill. We're doing everything we can to pass the bill.
But
The
are
window of
both
time
parties
is now, we're
supporting
very
it
serious about
generally?
it. Pardon?
Are both parties supporting it generally, because you said it's non-partisan? Is it that no party likes it? or
That
that
doesn't
all
mean
parties
partisans
like
view it that way.
No.
No, I think it's fair to say that we have a party that slaps the partisan label on almost everything right now. This is not an exception. Yeah. That doesn't mean there's not support from within both parties, because we know there are, and this has traditionally been a bipartisan introduced and supported bill. And it's passed in Utah. Utah has a local options bill. The Republicans there love it. So it does. It just depends on the narrative that kind of takes root. Yes.
So along those lines, I'm thinking if I'm a party boss, I like having my influence. I like being able to control results. What are the reactions from maybe not the rank and file, but the party chairs, at least in Minnesota or nationwide? It seems to me that there's an interest in keeping things the way they are so that power can.
Stay with them.
Education's really important. The rank and file has influenced substantially the leadership of the party. And in fact, our party chair has invited me to go and talk to other party chairs in the Democratic Party. So I wouldn't say that they're instinctively gonna lead on an issue like ranked choice voting. But the influence of the rank and file and bringing it up through all those conventions. And all of you could go home and email Ken Martin right now and say, I just learned about ranked choice voting.
And I
This is
can't
great.
wait to
I'm
see
so
you.
glad my party has it in their platform. Thanks, Ken. He'd love to get that kind of information. The rank and
Yes.
file has mattered a lot in terms of how the party leadership moves on an issue like this, and it happens over time. So it certainly isn't always at the first pass. But through experience and use and understanding, I think a lot of party chairs, certainly they have to have party interests first. That's true of any party. But many also really are in this work because they promote democracy with a small d as well, and ultimately help lead the rank and file in that direction. And Minnesota has it in the platform and has for the better part of a decade.
Yeah, this is related to that question. I mean, the goal of this is to replace the primary system. I mean, it seems like that's one of the goals, don't you think? That whole primary structure sort of lets people come together, sort things out, and we'll still have caucuses on issues, but do you think that the dynamics there are gonna stay in place for still wanting a primary and that they'll see this as a threat?
I'm so glad you came back with this question, because it gets to the question I didn't answer for you, which is one of the proposals made by Catherine Gale and Michael Porter was to have an open primary as opposed to a partisan primary. So that means basically we would do it the way we do it locally, except we'd use ranked choice voting. So let all these candidates, for example, all these candidates run, let's say this is a Minnesota race. All the candidates run, and the top 4 advance to the November election with a ranked ballot. You just transfer votes in a crowded race until you get the top 4. So no matter the party. And then use ranked choice voting again in the general election.
So conceivably, you could have 4 Republicans that end up at the top, and then you're choosing among the 4.
Very conceivably. The reason top 4 as opposed to top 2 is because when it is top 2, that happens. So
Right.
in California, they moved to a top 2 primary system.
Oh,
Awful. Like, it's what we're replacing at our local level. Why are they doing that? Well, the idea behind it's sound. For independents, it's really a Michael Bloomberg push. For independents, they want a voice in the primary that they now don't have when it's only between Democrats and Republicans. So open that process up. But we're so familiar with only a top 2, that's where they stopped. Not understanding the ramifications of doing that. And then still voters don't turn out in a primary, so about 10% of the people are winnowing the field down to 2, leaving all that choice off the ballot in November. So better the top 4. You're right, we need some way to vet before November. I would argue, I'm not gonna advocate to put 20 Democratic candidates on a ballot in November without vetting some way before that, right? And true at a gubernatorial election locally or anywhere else. But it could be either the top 4 or the partisan primary like we have it now. Maine implemented ranked choice voting in the partisan primary context. They didn't change that. Maine does what Minnesota does. We have partisan primaries for state and federal, and they use it in the partisan primary. And we could do it that way here. Strategically, that'd be the fastest route. And if that works and people want to go down to a top 4 in the future using ranked, great. That's always another layer that can be considered. And then, of course, we'd use it in the general election. So the easiest way to do this is to not really talk about recomposing our current structure. The more you try to do, the harder it is to kind of pass it through. And then just use it in the primary and the general. And again, in the primary, it's beneficial, even if it's in a partisan context, because you're able to build that coalition and end up as a stronger candidate out of that process, heading into the general election. Yes.
But you're not recommending the primary for anything below state level?
Correct. Nonpartisan primaries, we don't need them. No one comes out. The down ballot voting goes away. And you can just roll the nonpartisan primary into the nonpartisan general, basically. But when you jump to partisan races, you'll need some way to vet. So use it in the primary or the general. This is the part that gets, when we say no primary, then what does it mean for state partisan races? So I'd like to really walk people through the differences in application locally versus at a state level.
Jean, can I ask one question that kind of piggybacks on something he said? Has ranked choice voting been used, or could it effectively be used if you had, like, say, school board, you don't do a primary, you're electing 3 people? Could you use ranked choice voting when there's 3 positions rather than 1?
Yes, and it's so beneficial. For the same reason I was talking about opening up our single districts for House, for Congress, we could have multi-member districts. It'd be the same application. You rank and the top 3 move on. And the value of doing that is it gets rid of what is rampantly becoming a real big thing. People are putting candidates on school boards in particular in these at-large races and then encouraging the voters to bullet vote. Vote for only 1. Sacrifice your other 2 votes because your 2 other votes harm your first choice. That's what happens. Ranked choice voting eliminates that dynamic. Your second choice only comes into play once that candidate is defeated, or elected in this case. I'll come back to that. But it's common. So we often in school board races, if we really like a candidate, might only vote for that candidate. Yep. So that's another good reason why we want it on our school board. Counties would be a great application because who comes out and votes in a primary in a county? But they all have those primaries. Why do we do things like this? We're riding a dead horse. It doesn't work at all, but we keep riding.
So would you instruct voters on the ballot if you only wanted to vote for one, you would put that language
Right
on the
now?
ballot? But yeah, I mean, is that your recommendation? Is that what you would want to be on the ballot, that instruction, if you only want to vote for one?
Well, in a ranked setting, the ballot instruction, we like to push the city clerks as far as we can, because we want voters to understand the power of ranking. Don't say if you have only one. It's like asking a kid, if you wanna do your homework. No! Say, you have the option to rank your ballot. Rank as far as you have a preference, and stop ranking when you don't like anybody in it, because that empowers your ballot the most. So, something to that effect is what we really like ballot instruction to be, and then making sure people are clear that your second choice can never harm your first choice in a ranked ballot election, because it can't. It only comes into play. So in the at-large race, to ensure, so the threshold is reduced. So in a 3-person race on a school board, as a candidate, I need 25% of the vote to win, so I go get that. And if I'm really popular and I get double the number of votes I need, then the excess votes I get are reallocated. I don't need them, so rather than waste them, they get reallocated. So if all of you voted for me, and I get double the number, half your vote stays with me to keep my seat, and half of it goes on to your second choice. You get to keep on electing more
That's
people until all 3 seats are filled. It's eloquently accurate.
You lost, Bob.
I know. I know. I wasn't gonna go down there, but I did. I can show you by an
Who
example.
determines which half you keep and which half goes?
What's your ballot? So you voted for me, half your ballot stays with me and half goes on to your second choice. And if you do the same, your second choice, it could be
So
different.
it's like half a vote?
Yeah, so everyone gets one, the formal name for this whole thing is single transferable vote. Everyone gets one single vote that transfers until all the seats are filled. In a single seat race, you stop when you get to that one.
Right.
So you only eliminate candidates from the bottom.
So you just have to have 50.1%, and then the vote transfers. When your candidate has more than the majority, then your second vote transfers to the next candidate.
Well, again, the threshold, so
Or whatever the
you
threshold
guys are
is,
getting into the
60%.
weeds here, but I'll go there with you if you want. So in an at-large race for school board, if there are up to 3 candidates to win, the formula for determining that threshold of victory that a candidate now has to go out and get is determined by this simple numerator and denominator. 1 over the number of seats to fill plus 1. So in a single race, single seat race, like for governor or mayor, that's 1 over 1 plus 1, 1 half, 50%, plus 1 vote, always plus 1 vote. So as my seats grow in number, 3 seats in the case of a school board, it's 1 over 3 plus 1. That's 1/4. 1/4, 25%. So I, as a candidate now, need to go and win the hearts of 25% of the voters. And 2 others do the same. So now 75% of the voters,
It's
25, 25, and 25, have their voice heard directly by someone who's elected to office, as opposed to just 50%, right? So that's the concept behind it. It just represents more people directly, gets rid of the strategic voting dynamic, and allows voters to be represented more proportionally.
An important thing to remember about this conversation too is that even if it gets complicated on the back end in the
You still-
processing of it, it's still just you voting for your first, second,
Yeah.
first. The voters still.
The voter
have more
experience
power.
is,
Yeah,
the candidate has got to change their head. But the voters, it's very simple for them.
Yeah, as you're just ranking the same in single seat or multi-seat, and you just never have to be strategic.
With concerns about, voter and election integrity and wanting to have more paper ballots and that kind of thing, does there get to be any concern about, some computer program is allocating the votes and deciding who doesn't make the threshold and then reallocating?
Yeah.
Is there any?
The best news about all of this is it has actually made elections more transparent. One, it's much harder to manipulate and hack a vote if you have to figure out where you have to transfer in order to get the outcome you want. So it makes it more integral and less vulnerable to outright fraud.
Can it be done on paper?
Yeah, yeah, there's no switch.
So if some places just really wanted to have the paper ballot, you could still do ranked choice
And
voting.
two more things, the machines now actually make ballot images of all the ballots. I don't know if you knew that, but the new equipment does that. And then the software literally walks you through the reallocation of every ballot. You can't, it's completely verifiable, transparent, and accurate. So actually, no, it's enhanced the integrity of the system rather than the other way around. Yeah. So do we still have time